Hello, everyone. I am the Sleeper Man, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel also. Where are you from? And what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. What if a seemingly ordinary day became a chilling premonition of the worst news imaginable? Imagine riding a campus shuttle when a voice, clear as day, warns you of a tragedy that will unfold with eerie precision. In a twist of fate, a student hears a cryptic message predicting the death of a loved one and the loss of an important exam, events that would unravel in disturbing accuracy. Dive into a true story where reality blurs with the supernatural, leaving you questioning how much of our lives are truly within our control. Witness the unsettling events of a student's week that no one could have foreseen, and discover why some warnings are too chilling to ignore. When I was in college, I lived in an off-campus apartment with a roommate. Our complex had a shuttle service to campus, which was a lifesaver for getting to class. One day, as I rode the shuttle, something happened that still sends shivers down my spine. I was lost in my thoughts, mentally preparing for the week's exams, when I heard a voice. It was as clear as any of the students chatting around me. The voice said, "Your grandmother is going to die, and you are going to miss your economics test." I glanced around, expecting to see someone speaking, but everyone was absorbed in their own conversations or staring out the windows. It was unsettling. I tried to brush it off, attributing it to stress and fatigue. After all, I had 2 big exams coming up that week, and the economics test was later on. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I got back to the apartment, I must have looked pale and shaky because my roommate immediately asked what was up. I told her about the voice I'd heard. She listened with a skeptical look on her face and shrugged it off, attributing it to exam stress and my overactive imagination. To ease my nerves, she handed me a beer, which I gratefully accepted. I sat down, trying to calm myself, but the unease lingered. Just as I opened the beer, the phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was tight with emotion as she told me that my grandmother wasn't expected to make it through the night. She urged me to pack a bag and come home immediately. I was stunned. Everything seemed surreal, but I packed quickly and headed home, my mind racing with a mix of dread and confusion. My grandmother passed away that evening. The timing of the voice was too eerie to ignore. When I returned to school 2 days later for my remaining exam, it dawned on me that my economics test had been scheduled for the same day as her funeral. The voice had been completely accurate. Returning to school was a strange experience. I felt a deep heaviness in my chest that I couldn't shake. The campus was bustling with the usual activity, but everything seemed muted, as though I was seeing it through a fog. I walked around in a daze, my thoughts constantly drifting back to the unsettling voice on the shuttle and my grandmother's sudden death. The eeriness of it all seemed to follow me, clinging to the corners of my mind. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity, funeral arrangements, family gatherings, and endless condolences. I felt like a ghost, moving through a world that had suddenly shifted beneath my feet. Each moment was a painful reminder of the strange prediction and how it had come true in such a specific way. When I finally returned to campus, I was greeted by the usual chatter and noise of college life, but it felt hollow. I was still reeling from the loss and the bizarre premonition. My roommate tried to cheer me up, suggesting we go out and get some fresh air. We walked around the campus, and while it was nice to get out of the apartment, I couldn't escape the lingering discomfort. We stopped by a coffee shop near the campus, and as I sipped my drink, I tried to put the disturbing events behind me. My roommate chatted about trivial matters, but I was barely listening. My mind kept drifting back to that voice and how accurate it had been. I tried to rationalize it. Was it just a weird coincidence or something more sinister? The rain started falling heavily as we left the coffee shop, creating a soothing background of rain sounds. It was meant to be calming, but for me, it only added to the atmosphere of uncertainty. I found myself wondering if there were other inexplicable things lurking just out of sight, waiting to surface. As we headed back to the apartment, I resolved to focus on my remaining exams and try to move forward, but the memory of that day and the echoing voice stayed with me, a constant reminder of the strange intersection of reality and premonition. As I settled back into my routine, the weight of the events seemed to hang over me, affecting everything I did. Each day felt like a test of my ability to maintain normalcy despite the lingering strangeness. My remaining exams approached, and I tried to concentrate on studying, but my thoughts often drifted back to the voice and the eerie accuracy of its warning. One evening, as I was studying in my apartment, the silence was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was a classmate, offering to go over some study material together. I agreed, hoping that the distraction might help me clear my mind. We sat at the dining table, surrounded by textbooks and notes, discussing the upcoming exam. Despite my effort to focus, a sense of unease settled over me. It was as though the shadows in the room were whispering secrets I couldn't quite understand. The night wore on and my classmate eventually left. I was alone again, and the apartment felt colder than usual. I tried to shake off the creeping anxiety and get some rest, but sleep was elusive. I kept thinking about the voice on the shuttle, the uncanny prediction, and my grandmother's funeral. It was all too surreal to fully process. I needed to put it all behind me and focus on moving forward. In the dead of night, I was jolted awake by a loud crash from the kitchen. My heart raced as I fumbled for the light switch, my mind racing through possible explanations. I crept into the kitchen, finding nothing amiss except for a few dishes that had fallen from the counter. The disturbance seemed random, but the timing felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As I lay back down, the rain continued to patter against the windows, its rhythm soothing yet unsettling. The sound of the rain was a constant reminder of the night's events and the strange voice that had predicted them. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that I had to focus on my exams and my future, but the echo of that voice and the strange occurrences left me with an unsettling feeling that would not easily be forgotten. The day of my remaining exam arrived, and the anxiety was almost unbearable. The weight of the previous days felt like a physical burden as I made my way to the exam hall. The weather matched my mood perfectly, overcast and drizzly, with the rain continuing to provide a steady, rhythmic backdrop of sound. It was as if the world was echoing the unease that had settled within me. Sitting in the exam room, I tried to push aside my thoughts of the past week and focus on the test. But the memory of my grandmother's funeral and the unsettling premonition lingered. I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread, wondering if something else was lurking just out of sight. Despite my efforts, the tension was palpable, and the exam felt like a blur. After the exam, I returned to my apartment, hoping to find some comfort in the familiar surroundings. However, I sat down to relax and reflect on the past week. The apartment was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the persistent patter of rain against the windows. I was exhausted and emotionally drained, but I couldn't fully shake the feeling of unease. As I tried to relax, my thoughts drifted back to the voice on the shuttle, the accurate prediction, and the eerie coincidence of missing my economics exam due to my grandmother's funeral. The unsettling nature of the experience made it difficult to process. I couldn't fully explain what had happened, and the feeling of something beyond my control remained. In the end, the strange experience left me with more questions than answers. The voice's accuracy had been chilling, and the emotional turmoil of the past week had taken its toll. I couldn't dismiss it as mere coincidence, and the memory of those days continued to haunt me. It was a stark reminder of how reality can sometimes intersect with the inexplicable, leaving us with a lingering sense of unease that's hard to shake off. The snowstorm had left a pristine blanket of white over the campus. I had just trudged back to my on-campus apartment, the snow crunching under my boots, every step muffled by the deep layer that had settled. The winter chill was biting, and the sky was a slate gray, hinting at more to come. The townhouse I lived in was a cozy enough spot: ground floor living space, kitchen, dining room with a large window that overlooked the backyard. My roommate was away that week, so the place was quiet, save for the occasional gust of wind outside. I was used to the quiet. We'd had some trouble in the past with people knocking at the back door, so I made a point of leaving the back light on every night. It was more for reassurance than anything else. I flicked the switch as I walked over to the dining room, and that's when I noticed something off. The light cast long shadows through the window, but it wasn't just shadows that caught my eye. Fresh boot prints were etched into the snow, perfectly preserved as if they had just been made. They were right outside the dining room window, standing still, facing in. My heart skipped a beat. I bent closer to the window, my breath fogging up the glass, and saw something even more unsettling, a greasy face print smeared across the window pane. It looked like someone had been pressed up against it, staring in. What made it worse was that there were no tracks leading away or coming towards the window. It was as though whoever had been out there had simply materialized, made their mark, and vanished. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The snow had not yet covered the prints or the face smudge, which meant they had been left very recently. I snapped a few photos on my phone, but they did little to ease my growing unease. I called a friend and asked if they could stay over. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, despite knowing no one was supposed to be out there. The rest of the evening was spent in nervous anticipation, with every creak and groan of the old building making me jump. The snow continued to fall gently outside, making the world seem even more silent and strange. When my friend arrived, we went over to check the back door together, but there was nothing new to see, just the cold, silent snow. This eerie occurrence wasn't a one-off. Over the course of that winter, similar footprints and face prints appeared a few more times. Each instance brought with it the same feeling of dread and confusion, always in the dead of night. I never did find out who or what was responsible for those unsettling visits. The weeks passed, and the winter's grip only tightened. Each snowfall seemed to blanket the world in a deeper layer of quiet. My friend had returned to their own place, but the presence of those mysterious footprints had left an indelible mark on my peace of mind. I tried to tell myself that it was just someone playing a prank or a figment of my overactive imagination, but the unnerving reality kept me on edge. One evening, after a particularly heavy snowstorm, I came back from a long day of classes and work. The sun had set early, and the night was thick with an oppressive silence. The snow was still falling, its gentle patter muffled by the thick layer that had already settled. I was eager to get inside and relax, but the familiar dread began to creep up as I approached the back door. I flipped the back light on automatically, a habit that had become almost ritualistic. As I reached the dining room, I glanced out the window, half expecting to see those haunting prints again. To my dismay, there they were, fresh and unmissable, just as before. The prints were arranged in the same eerie pattern, standing and facing inward, and the greasy face print was smeared across the glass as if someone had pressed their face against it in an attempt to peer inside. This time the sight made my skin crawl more than ever. I could almost feel the cold, greasy imprint on the window even though I wasn't touching it. I grabbed my phone and took more photos, but they did nothing to alleviate the unease gnawing at me. The snow-covered yard looked stark and deserted, and yet the strange footprints seemed to haunt me with their inexplicable presence. As the night wore on, I locked every door and window, double-checking them for any sign of tampering. The usual nighttime sounds, the distant hum of traffic. The occasional dog bark seemed to fade into an unsettling silence. I tried to focus on studying and distracting myself, but the feeling of being watched never quite left. The tension built up as the hours ticked by, each creak of the building making me jump. Sleep was elusive that night. I kept imagining footsteps crunching through the snow, though every time I looked outside, everything remained still. Oh, sorry. The sense of foreboding grew with each passing hour, a constant reminder of the strange, unsettling visits that had become a recurring nightmare. It was as if the snow itself had become a blanket of fear, hiding the unknown but amplifying every shadow and sound. The winter continued its relentless course, and the unnerving encounters outside my back door became a part of my routine. Each snowfall seemed to bring a fresh layer of anxiety, compounded by the odd appearances of those chilling footprints. Despite my best efforts to ignore them, they had become a constant source of dread, lurking just beyond the light's reach. One particularly frigid night, I came back to the apartment later than usual. The campus was eerily quiet, the snow muffling even the faintest sounds. As I approached the townhouse, I noticed the back light casting a dim glow through the falling snow. I hesitated for a moment, dreading what I might find. When I finally looked out the dining room window, the familiar sight greeted me: fresh footprints, and the greasy face print. But this time, there was something new. A new set of prints had appeared. These were smaller, almost childlike, and they seemed to surround the previous set. They formed a semicircle around the larger prints, and the face print had grown more pronounced, as if someone had pressed harder against the window. It was as if the new prints were inspecting the old ones, their presence adding a layer of eeriness to the already unsettling scene. I stood frozen, my breath fogging up the window as I tried to make sense of the situation. The snow continued to fall, adding a ghostly quality to the scene. I knew I had to act, so I called another friend and asked if they could come over, but they were unavailable. With no other options, I decided to stay awake, determined to catch whoever or whatever was leaving these marks. I spent the rest of the night in a state of heightened alertness. I locked all the doors and windows again, ensuring that no one could get inside. I kept glancing outside, half expecting to see movement in the darkness. The quiet of the night was oppressive, and the snow seemed to hold its breath along with me. My own fears felt magnified, each small sound or shift in the shadows making me jump. By morning, the footprints and face print were still there, undisturbed by the snowfall. The day's light revealed the full extent of the marks, making them seem even more menacing. I decided to document everything thoroughly, taking detailed notes and more photographs. Yet, despite my attempts to rationalize the situation, the fear lingered. The cold winter days felt even colder, haunted by the memories of the previous night. The days stretched on, each snowstorm adding to the pile of cold white dread outside my apartment. The peculiar footprints continued to appear sporadically, each time leaving me more unnerved than before. My attempts to rationalize the situation had failed, and every night became a battle with my own growing fear. One night, as I was settling in after a long day, the snowfall had paused, leaving the world bathed in an eerie stillness. I was exhausted, but I had resolved to stay vigilant, convinced that tonight might be different. The wind howled faintly, adding to the chill that had settled in my bones. I approached the dining room window with a sense of foreboding. When I flipped on the backlight, the sight outside was even more disturbing than usual. The footprints had changed again. They now led from the edge of the yard to the window, and then continued off into the snow in a random, chaotic pattern. But what was truly unsettling was the new addition, a small object left just outside the back door. It was an old, faded toy, barely recognizable in the dim light, but its presence was unmistakable. I felt a shiver run through me as I stared at the toy, my mind racing to understand its significance. I reached for my phone to capture the latest development, but as I focused on taking a photo, I heard a faint noise, a soft shuffling sound from outside. My heart pounded as I glanced nervously around, the darkness of the winter night pressing in. The shuffling grew louder, and my anxiety peaked. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped cautiously to the back door, my breath coming in shallow bursts. I shone the light out into the snow, searching for any sign of movement, but the yard remained eerily empty. The toy was still there, and the footprints led off into the distance, disappearing into the unbroken snow. I felt a rush of cold air as the wind picked up, sending a shiver down my spine. I made a quick decision and returned to the warmth of the apartment, locking the door behind me. As the night dragged on, I remained on edge, my mind replaying the events and the strange presence outside. Each creak of the building seemed louder, each gust of wind more sinister. By morning, the toy had vanished, leaving no trace of its presence. The footprints were still there, but they had been partially obscured by the new layer of snow. I couldn't explain the night's events, nor could I shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. The winter continued, but I remained haunted by that final unnerving encounter. The true nature of the visitor remained a mystery, leaving me with an unsettling sense of unresolved fear. The winter days eventually gave way to spring, but the memory of those chilling nights stayed with me, a reminder of the true horror of the unknown and the inexplicable. We had always been the type to enjoy a good scare. My husband and I, living together in our quaint 1930s studio apartment, had been looking forward to diving into American Horror Story. We had heard great things about it and decided it was the perfect way to spend a weekend night. The old building itself was the kind that felt like it had stories to tell, creaky floors and narrow hallways that added to the ambience. By the time we settled in for bed, we were both still buzzing from the suspenseful marathon we'd just wrapped up. Around 2 a.m., with the eerie glow of the streetlights filtering through the thin curtains. We drifted off to sleep, still rattled but excited from our late-night horror binge. The sound of rain against the window was oddly soothing, a perfect backdrop for the kind of sleep that only a good scare can induce. The night was quiet save for the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance, but that tranquility was shattered about 2 hours later. I woke up to a jarring noise, TV static blasting through the apartment. My eyes shot open, and my heart raced as I tried to piece together what was happening. It was disorienting. Wed had a TV that muted itself automatically during static, so hearing it at such volume was unsettling. I quickly got out of bed, fumbling through the dark room, and went over to turn off the TV. That's when I noticed something that froze me in my tracks. The apartment door was wide open. Our studio was small, with the bedroom door leading directly into the main hallway of the building. In the dead of night, with the rain still drumming against the windows, the sight of the open door was more than unnerving. The possibility of someone having come in while we slept felt more disturbing than the ghost stories we had just watched. Despite my usual skepticism about ghosts, this felt off. I had to confront the stark reality of what could have happened. We had never met any of our neighbors, so the chance of someone pulling a prank seemed remote. And if it was a person, how had they vanished so quickly? We had woken up the instant the static blared, and there was no sign of anyone rushing out the door. The thought of an intruder left me feeling more vulnerable than any horror show could. We scoured the apartment, every nook and cranny, but there was no sign of anyone. The eerie quiet returned, interrupted only by the continuing rain outside. It was as if the disturbance had never happened. We were left with more questions than answers, and an uneasy feeling that lingered long after we went back to bed. The silence in the apartment was almost oppressive now, hanging over us like a heavy curtain. I tried to shake off the creeping sense of dread as I inspected every corner of the small studio. My husband followed closely behind, his face a mixture of concern and disbelief. We checked the windows, the closet, and even under the furniture. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, every creak in the floorboard a potential threat. The open door was still a focal point of our anxiety. It had been wide open when I first noticed it, and the hallway outside was dark and still. I half expected to see someone lurking in the shadows, but the only thing there was the faint glow of the hallway's single, dim light bulb. I could hear the distant, rhythmic patter of rain against the pavement, a sound that was usually calming but now felt eerily out of place. What the hell happened? My husband muttered, more to himself than to me. His voice was low and strained, as if he was trying to convince himself that everything was fine. I could see the worry etched on his face. He was usually the level-headed one, but tonight even he seemed unsettled. We closed the door and locked it, though it felt like a hollow gesture. I glanced at the TV, which was now off. The static was gone, but the volume was still unnaturally high for a TV that was supposed to mute itself. The remote was exactly where we had left it on the coffee table, untouched. Nothing seemed amiss apart from the fact that we'd been woken up by a loud static noise. The more we searched, the less sense it made. I began to rationalize everything, trying to convince myself that perhaps it was a malfunction of the TV or some strange coincidence, but the open door kept gnawing at me. How could we have not heard anyone come in or leave? We had been sound asleep, yet the noise had been loud enough to wake us instantly. The sheer implausibility of the situation was what made it so unsettling. The rain continued its steady rhythm, creating a hypnotic backdrop to our mounting anxiety. Despite our best efforts to rationalize the situation, the sense of dread lingered. We eventually settled back into bed, but sleep was elusive. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind seemed amplified and unnerving. We lay awake, both of us silently grappling with the same unspoken fear. What if someone had been in our apartment while we slept? Morning light crept into the apartment, slowly pushing away the darkness of the night. The rain had stopped, leaving a stillness in its wake that seemed to echo through the studio. I lay there, wide awake, with the events of the night replaying over and over in my mind. My husband was already up, his silhouette moving around the kitchen. I could tell he was trying to regain a sense of normalcy, but the strain was evident in his movements. I got out of bed, still feeling the weight of last night's disturbance. As I moved through the apartment, I noticed that everything seemed as it should be. The door was locked, the TV was off, and nothing appeared out of place. Yet, The sense of unease persisted. I couldn't shake the image of the door being open, or the sound of static blaring through the silence. My husband had made coffee and we sat at the tiny kitchen table, the steaming mugs offering a small comfort. We discussed the possibility of a malfunctioning TV, but it didn't quite add up. "It's just too strange," he said, shaking his head. "The TV shouldn't have been that loud, and the door, I don't know what to make of it." We decided to check with the building's management, hoping to find some explanation. The building was old and maintenance issues weren't uncommon. Maybe someone had accidentally entered our apartment, or perhaps there was a technical problem with the TV system. It was worth asking, even if it didn't fully resolve our fears. The building manager, a middle-aged man with a tired demeanor, listened patiently to our concerns. He promised to check the security footage and get back to us. As we left his office, a part of me hoped for an explanation that would make sense, something that would put our minds at ease. But another part of me feared that there was no rational answer, that the unease we felt was more than just a simple glitch. We spent the rest of the day trying to distract ourselves. We went for a walk, tried to enjoy a meal, and did our best to focus on other things. Despite our efforts, the night loomed over us. The thought of falling asleep in the same apartment, with the memory of the static and the open door still fresh in our minds, made it hard to relax. As night fell again, the studio apartment seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next chapter of our unnerving experience. We had tried to move on, but the previous night's events left an indelible mark. The small, seemingly insignificant space felt different, now charged with an uneasy energy that refused to dissipate. We returned home, both of us dreading the prospect of another night. Our attempts to contact the building manager had yielded no new information. He hadn't found anything unusual in the security footage, and no one had reported entering our apartment. It was as if the incident had simply evaporated into the night, leaving no trace behind. We decided to spend the evening in a way that would help us relax. We put on a lighthearted movie and tried to distract ourselves. The laughter and chatter on screen were a temporary balm, but the shadow of what had happened still lingered. Every sudden sound or flicker of movement made us jump, and the night seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of us. Just before we went to bed, my husband noticed something on the TV stand. The remote was in a different position from where Wed left it. It was a small detail, but it set our nerves on edge. We checked the TV, finding it turned off and silent. As we prepared for bed, the door was firmly closed and locked. We made a point of ensuring everything was in order. Though the sense of foreboding remained, we fell asleep eventually. Though neither of us was truly at ease, the night passed without incident. No loud static, no open door. When we awoke the next morning, the apartment was as it should be. It was as though the previous night's disturbance had never happened, leaving us with an eerie sense of normalcy. The experience remains a vivid memory, a reminder of how quickly the ordinary can turn unsettling. We've often discussed the incident, trying to piece together what happened that night, but the answers remain elusive. Whether it was a malfunction, a prank, or something else entirely, we'll never truly know. What we do know is that the studio apartment was never quite the same afterward, and the static remains a haunting reminder of one unsettling night. The day started off like any other, with a casual walk through the city park. I had just taken a photo of a bush of yellow roses to send to my best friend. Her dad had passed away recently, and yellow roses were his favorite. It was a small gesture meant to offer some comfort during a tough time. Little did I know that this simple act would lead me into a web of unsettling coincidences. A few months later, I found myself moving into a new place with some roommates. It wasn't until I arrived that I realized the house was the very one from my earlier photo. The shock was immediate, but I brushed it off as a strange coincidence. It was a large city after all, and there were bound to be multiple houses with similar features. Things took a darker turn when one of my roommates, a quiet guy who kept to himself, overdosed and died in his room. The room where I had just been settling in was now a site of tragedy. The weight of what happened was heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the house. I decided to break my lease and move out, seeking some distance from the unsettling past of that place. Fast forward a few months, and I found new roommates. One of their friends went to rehab, and when she came out, I started talking to her. To my shock, she mentioned that she had been living in that very house and using drugs in the same room where my previous roommate had died. The coincidences seemed to be stacking up in an eerie manner. The final twist came when I started dating someone new. Things were going well until I visited his place. You can guess where this is headed. He lived in the same house. When I told him about the unsettling coincidences, he seemed sympathetic but insisted it was just a series of odd coincidences. Things got intense between us, but when he took off his shirt, I saw a tattoo in the exact spot where my deceased roommate had his. The tattoo's similarity was too uncanny to ignore. Feeling a profound sense of dread, I ended the relationship and left the city as quickly as I could. My new apartment was supposed to be a fresh start, away from the eerie coincidences of the old house. I hoped to find some peace, but the more I tried to distance myself from the past, the more it seemed to follow me. I'd moved to a different part of the city, trying to leave behind the unsettling series of events. Yet, the memory of the house lingered like a shadow, refusing to be left behind. One rainy evening, I decided to relax and catch up on some reading. As the rain pattered against the windows, it created a soothing background of rain sounds, almost like a sleep aid to calm my nerves. I tried to lose myself in the pages of a book, hoping that focusing on something mundane might help me forget the bizarre coincidences that had plagued my recent past. The rain outside was a comforting reminder that life goes on, despite the dark events that seemed to cloud my recent memories. But tranquility was short-lived. That night, I had a vivid dream, or maybe it was more of a nightmare. I found myself back in the old house. The layout was familiar, the rooms exactly as I remembered them, but everything felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in, and the once comfortable spaces became claustrophobic. I wandered through the rooms, each more unsettling than the last, until I reached the room where my former roommate had died. The door was slightly ajar, and from within I could hear faint whispers. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding. The dream had felt so real, like a disturbing echo from the past. I tried to brush it off as just a dream, but the details were too vivid to ignore. The whispers had felt almost tangible, and the room's appearance was exactly how I remembered it from the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that perhaps the house had left a mark on me that I couldn't easily escape. Despite my efforts to move on, the past seemed determined to remain part of my present. Each coincidence, each unsettling event felt like a piece of a puzzle I couldn't quite complete. I wondered if I'd ever be free of the house's shadow, or if I was doomed to be haunted by the series of eerie connections it had left in its wake. Life in my new apartment felt like a reprieve, but the sense of unease never completely faded. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, or an overactive mind working overtime. But then, one day, I got an unexpected call from an old friend. She was back in town and wanted to catch up. I agreed, thinking it would be nice to reconnect and share a few laughs. Little did I know that this reunion would stir up old memories and reveal even more unsettling truths. We decided to meet at a cafe, a safe distance from the old house. As we reminisced, she shared some news that took me by surprise. One of her friends had recently moved into the very house where all those coincidences had happened. My stomach sank as she described the house with its familiar layout and eerie reputation. She mentioned that this friend had also experienced strange occurrences, including feeling watched and hearing unexplained noises. The connection to my old roommate's room was particularly unsettling. I tried to play it cool, but the conversation left me rattled. The idea that someone else was now experiencing the same unsettling sensations I had felt was deeply disturbing. I couldn't help but think about how the coincidences seemed to be piling up, each more unsettling than the last. It was as if the house had a way of reaching out, affecting everyone who came near it, weaving its shadow into their lives. That night, as I lay in bed trying to process everything, the rain started again. The rhythmic tapping against my window provided a calming backdrop, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. The stories my friend had shared echoed in my mind, and I began to question whether the house had some sort of malevolent influence, or if it was all just a series of bizarre coincidences. The thought that it might be affecting others the way it had affected me was almost too much to bear. Sleep came fitfully, accompanied by nightmares that felt disturbingly real. I couldn't escape the feeling that the house was somehow still reaching out. Even from a distance, the sense of foreboding only deepened my anxiety, making me wonder if I would ever truly be free from the house's lingering influence. After the unsettling conversation with my friend, I decided to take a break from everything. I thought a change of scenery might help clear my mind and put some distance between myself and the strange events. I planned a weekend getaway to the countryside, hoping that the fresh air and quiet surroundings would offer some much-needed relief. The first night at the cabin was peaceful, with only the sounds of nature to keep me company. The absence of city noise and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze provided a stark contrast to the tension I'd felt for months. I was finally starting to relax, convinced that the house and its strange coincidences were behind me. On the second night, as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard a knock on the cabin door. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I hesitated for a moment before getting up to check. When I opened the door, I was met with a man I didn't recognize. He looked disheveled and anxious, and he introduced himself as someone who had been staying in the house where all the coincidences began. His story was chillingly familiar. He told me that he had also experienced strange occurrences in the house, mysterious sounds, unsettling dreams, and an inexplicable feeling of being watched. He had moved out quickly, convinced that something was wrong with the house. His description of his experiences was almost identical to mine, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. It was as if the house's dark influence was spreading, affecting anyone who came into contact with it. I listened, my heart racing as he recounted his own series of bizarre coincidences and disturbing experiences. It became clear that the house had a disturbing history that seemed to affect everyone who lived there. I could feel the weight of the past pressing down on me, and it was as though the house was reaching out, pulling me back into its shadowy grasp. When the man finally left, I was left alone with my thoughts, the night air heavy with unease. The rain began to fall again, creating a backdrop of familiar sounds that now seemed ominous rather than comforting. The final twist of meeting someone else affected by the same house only deepened my sense of dread. It was clear that the house had left its mark on more lives than just mine, and I couldn't escape its shadow, no matter how far I ran. As I packed my things and prepared to leave, I realized that the house and its eerie coincidences had become a part of me. The experiences were unsettling, but they had also taught me a valuable lesson about the connections we make and the places we inhabit. As I drove away from the cabin, I vowed to leave behind the darkness of the house and move forward, carrying with me the knowledge that some stories are better left behind, as chilling and unforgettable as they may be. I was never one to shy away from the macabre, so when Edgar suggested we check out the old church and parsonage up on the hill, I jumped at the chance. It was the summer of 1987, and this small town had seen better days. The church, built over a century ago, had fallen into disrepair, its once proud steeple now a rusty skeleton against the sky. The parsonage next door wasn't any better. Both buildings were wrapped in layers of peeling paint and neglected vines, adding the church's graveyard into the mix. It was the perfect setting for a chilling adventure. We approached the place around mid-afternoon, the sunlight struggling to pierce through the thick, dark clouds. Rain sounds were faint in the distance, adding an eerie backdrop to our exploration. We made our way into the parsonage first. The front door creaked open with a groan, revealing a musty interior untouched by the hands of time. Dust particles floated in the dim light, giving the air an almost tangible quality. As we wandered through the rooms, the atmosphere grew heavier with each step. The stale air seemed to cling to us, making every breath feel labored. When we reached one of the bedrooms, I noticed a strong, metallic smell. It was so intense, I could almost taste the iron at the back of my throat. The scent was unmistakable, like blood. It was so overpowering that it made my eyes water and my head spin. My heartbeat quickened as the taste grew more pronounced. I tried to call out to Edgar, but his voice seemed distant, as if muffled by an invisible barrier. I staggered out of the room, the smell vanishing instantly as I crossed the threshold. Edgar, looking alarmed, asked if I was okay. He hadn't noticed the smell at all. His concern was palpable, and it only added to my growing sense of unease. We decided to leave immediately, the sudden urgency of the situation overshadowing our earlier curiosity. Back outside, the rain sounds grew louder, as if the weather itself was reacting to our departure. We learned later that a young woman had died in that house many years ago, during childbirth. Both she and her baby had been buried in the graveyard next door. The cause of her death was massive hemorrhaging, fitting with the smell that had nearly overwhelmed me. The church burned down in 1990, and the parsonage was demolished soon after. Even now, every time I drive by that graveyard, a shiver runs down my spine, as if the past is reaching out to remind me of that unsettling day. The day after our eerie encounter, Edgar and I couldn't stop talking about it. The smell, the disorientation, it was as if Wed stepped into a horror story that was all too real. The curiosity, however, was overpowering. We both wanted to understand what had happened, though part of me was also deeply unsettled by the whole experience. I felt a strange compulsion to revisit the scene, despite the lingering unease. A few nights later, I found myself driving up the hill toward the old church and parsonage. The sky was a dark shade of gray, and the wind had picked up, creating a howling sound that made the night feel even more oppressive. The rain was coming down in sheets, turning the path to the parsonage into a muddy mess. I parked the car a little distance away and made my way on foot, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Entering the property felt like stepping into another world. The church's remnants were barely visible through the rain and fog, but the parsonage stood as a dark silhouette against the night sky. The graveyard, now more overgrown and forlorn, seemed to loom over everything. I approached the house cautiously, the rain making the ground slippery underfoot. Once inside, I tried to ignore the growing feeling of dread. The familiar musty smell was still there, but now it seemed intermingled with the scent of wet earth. I made my way to the bedroom where I had previously experienced the overwhelming smell. The room was just as I remembered it, dusty, with furniture covered in sheets. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. As I stood there, trying to steady my nerves, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a matter of being watched. It was more of an acute awareness that something had happened in this room, something tragic and horrifying. I quickly left the room, and despite the rain, couldn't get out of there fast enough. The sense of foreboding was almost palpable, making it clear that some places are better left undisturbed. I drove away, the graveyard disappearing in the rearview mirror, hoping never to return. Weeks had passed since our last visit to the old parsonage, and the experience lingered in my mind like a stubborn stain. Despite the church and house being gone, the feeling of unease remained. It was as if the place had imprinted itself on me, and every time I passed by the now empty lot, I couldn't help but shiver. Edgar felt similarly, had mentioned having nightmares about the place, and we both decided to put it behind us. However, one evening, I found myself unable to shake the need to go back. The curiosity was stronger than ever, pulling me toward the site once more. It was another rainy night, and the sounds of the rain hitting my car's roof were soothing, almost like a sleep aid. The clouds hung low, and the mist enveloped the area, creating a ghostly atmosphere. I parked at the edge of the old property, where the church and parsonage had once stood. As I approached the site, the rain seemed to grow heavier, and the ground was slick with mud. The absence of the buildings was strange. The space felt almost too quiet. I walked around the perimeter of where the parsonage used to stand, feeling a strange sense of disorientation. My flashlight cut through the mist, illuminating nothing but the remnants of an old foundation. I noticed something odd, a rusted gate that had been partially hidden by overgrowth. It led to a small, forgotten area behind the parsonage's original location. Curiosity getting the better of me, I pushed through the foliage and discovered a narrow, overgrown path that led to a small, dilapidated shed. The air here felt different, heavy with the scent of decay and rain. I decided to investigate, even though every instinct was telling me to leave. Inside the shed, the air was still, and the darkness seemed to press in on me. My flashlight flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows on the walls. There was nothing remarkable inside, just old rotting furniture and cobwebs. Yet, as I turned to leave, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, causing me to spin around. The shed was empty, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. I bolted out of there, my heart racing, and drove away from the property once more, feeling a profound sense of relief as the familiar sights of the town came into view. The months that followed were filled with a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. The old church and parsonage had been erased from the landscape, and with their disappearance, I hoped to leave the unsettling experiences behind. Yet, every time I passed the graveyard, a shiver would run down my spine. The events of that summer seemed to have carved themselves into my memory, leaving an indelible mark. One particularly stormy night, I found myself drawn back to the site for what I hoped would be the last time. The wind howled through the trees and the rain pounded against my car's windows, creating a rhythm that was oddly soothing. I parked at a nearby overlook and walked down the path to where the church and parsonage once stood. The area was now a flat, empty lot with no trace of the buildings that had once dominated it. As I stood there, the rain cascading around me, I felt a strange sense of closure. The old graveyard was still there, its gravestones weathered and worn. I walked among them, the rain mixing with the mud underfoot. The cemetery was quiet, save for the sound of the rain and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. I felt a mix of sadness and finality, as if I were saying goodbye to something I never truly understood. Standing by the graves, I thought about the young woman and her child who had died so tragically. The smell of blood, the feeling of being watched, these were all fragments of a story that had unfolded long before my time. I paid my respects in my own way, acknowledging their presence in a manner that felt right to me. It was my attempt to make peace with the experiences I had endured. As I left the graveyard and drove away, the storm seemed to abate, and the rain became a gentle drizzle. The haunting presence that had once loomed over me seemed to have lifted, replaced by a quiet resignation. I glanced back one last time as I drove away, feeling that the old church and parsonage, along with their shadows, were finally a part of the past. The story of the old church was now complete, leaving behind only memories and a sense of uneasy tranquility. Living in an apartment building that used to be an old hospital from the 19th century wasn't something you'd find in a typical rental listing. The building had been gutted and transformed into a maze of oddly shaped apartments. The old patient rooms were now long, narrow spaces, and the original doors, brass handles and all, were still there, though nailed shut and painted over to match the walls. It was a strange place, full of odd angles and echoes, a perfect setting for a college student with a tight budget. Footsteps in the hallway were a nightly soundtrack. They'd echo through the building with a rhythmic persistence that made it impossible to ignore. The sound of someone or something moving up and down the hallways became so routine that friends would refuse to stay the night. I never understood why they were so scared. I just figured it was the building settling, or some old pipes acting up. Still, I always kept my door shut tight at night. I didn't want to see what was making those noises. One night, at around 3 a.m., I was yanked from a deep sleep by what can only be described as furious knocking on my bedroom door. It was as if someone was on the other side, pounding their fists against the wood, trying to break in. The sound was deafening and frantic, making the clothes hanging on the back of the door shake with every violent blow. My heart raced as the noise hammered relentlessly. It lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds felt like an eternity. I lay frozen in my bed, terrified and bewildered. Just as abruptly as it started, the pounding stopped. I called out into the silence, my voice trembling. "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. I lay there, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was clear as day. Someone or something had been banging on my door. I was alone, but the sound was unmistakable. Summoning every ounce of courage, I finally opened the door to check the hallway. It was empty, eerily quiet, and completely devoid of any sign of disturbance. My palms were slick with sweat as I stared into the empty corridor. I couldn't explain it then, and I still can't now. The memory of that night, of the furious knocking and the empty hallway, is one of those true scary stories that stays with you long after you've escaped the fear. The silence after the knocking was almost as unsettling as the noise itself. The hallway was still, devoid of any signs of life or movement. I stood there, door open, trying to convince myself that it had been a bad dream. But the shaking clothes and the pounding on the door felt all too real. I tried to go back to sleep, but the fear had already taken hold, clawing at my nerves. The next morning I told myself it was just the building settling, or perhaps a prank. I was a broke college student, and the apartment was cheap for a reason. I couldn't afford to move, so I had to deal with it. Yet, as the days went by, the incident seemed to linger in my mind, making every creak and groan of the building seem more ominous. The footsteps in the hallway took on a new, more sinister tone. Each night, they seemed to come closer to my door, and each night I would find myself listening more intently, hoping they'd pass by without incident. One particularly stormy night, the wind howled outside, and rain pounded against the windows. The sound of the storm made the usual noises of the building even more pronounced. I lay in bed trying to drown out the rain sounds, but every drip and thud seemed amplified. The familiar footsteps started again, but this time, they felt different. They were more erratic, almost as if someone was pacing back and forth anxiously. The knocking didn't come back that night, but the eerie feeling persisted. It was as if the storm had stirred up something in the building. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just beyond my door, something that didn't want to be seen. The fear was all-consuming, making it impossible to relax or feel safe. The next morning, I found myself staring at the same old doors and brass handles, trying to make sense of what had happened. The building was old, and there were many stories about it, but I never paid much attention to them. I had always dismissed them as urban legends. Now, though, I wasn't so sure. The incident felt too real to ignore, and the silence that followed was deafening. My thoughts were a jumbled mess of confusion and fear, as if the night had left an indelible mark on me. A few nights later, the atmosphere in the apartment was unusually tense. The storm from the previous night had passed, but the weather remained oppressive. The rain seemed to hang in the air, and the humidity made everything feel damp and heavy. I lay in bed, my mind racing, replaying the events of that terrifying night. I was convinced I'd never fully escaped the anxiety that had taken root. The footsteps were back, moving more deliberately this time. The rhythm was unsettling, like a deliberate cadence that echoed through the hall. Each step seemed to get closer, and with every passing minute my dread grew. I held my breath, straining to hear over the constant hum of the old building. I couldn't tell if the footsteps were getting nearer, or if my imagination was playing tricks on me. It felt like the apartment itself was alive, breathing, and shifting, with a mind of its own. Suddenly, a sharp noise cut through the stillness, a loud bang from somewhere in the building. My heart leapt into my throat, and I sat up in bed, frozen with fear. The sound had come from somewhere far off, but it felt like it was right outside my door. I wanted to check, to see if something had changed, but the fear kept me rooted in place. The thought of opening the door and facing whatever might be out there was unbearable. The footsteps continued their relentless march, their source remaining frustratingly elusive. I felt trapped in my own apartment, the walls closing in as the sounds grew louder. The fear was consuming, a constant companion that seemed to grow stronger with every passing moment. I tried to focus on anything other than the noises, but every creak and groan of the building only intensified my anxiety. As the night dragged on, I finally managed to drift into a fitful sleep, only to be jolted awake by the same furious knocking. It was a brief, intense burst of noise that seemed to come from every direction at once. My nerves were on edge as I stumbled out of bed, my mind racing. But as I opened the door, once again the hallway was empty, and the silence was almost mocking in its stillness. I closed the door behind me, my mind a whirl of fear and confusion. The weeks that followed were a blur of anxiety and dread. The building's strange noises and my own mounting fear seemed to intertwine, creating a constant sense of unease. I started to notice little things, doors creaking, lights flickering, and a general sense that something was off. Each night I braced myself for the familiar footsteps and the occasional eerie bang, but they never reached the intensity of that first night. One particularly cold evening, the atmosphere in the apartment was dense with an unsettling chill. I was alone, wrapped in a blanket, trying to distract myself with a movie. The familiar sound of footsteps began again, but this time they seemed different, almost deliberate. The rhythm was now a slow, methodical pace, and it seemed to circle around my apartment. I tried to convince myself it was just the building settling, but the rhythmic pattern felt intentional. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The footsteps grew more persistent, moving closer to my door. My pulse quickened. The knocking, however, never came back. Instead, the building seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something. The silence that followed was oppressive, hanging heavily in the air. The next morning I found myself standing in the hallway, trying to make sense of everything. The building looked the same as it always did, old, worn, and unchanged. The brass handles gleamed dully under the fluorescent lights, and the walls were as nondescript as ever. I was determined to face my fears, but the more I tried to understand, the more elusive the answers seemed. It was as if the building was hiding something it would never reveal. Eventually, I moved out, unable to handle the lingering sense of dread any longer. The apartment remained a relic of its past, with its echoes and whispers. Even now, years later, I sometimes wonder about that place. The footsteps, the knocking, what were they? Just old pipes and creaky floors, or something more? You'll never know for sure, but those memories have become a part of my own collection of true scary stories, reminders of a time when fear was just a door away. When we bought the foreclosed house in rural Minnesota, the bank had made some hasty repairs. The previous occupants, a family of 4, had left the place in a state that looked like a war zone. The bedroom doors were scarred with what appeared to be knife stab marks, and the screen on one of the windows was shredded. We shrugged it off as the result of a house being trashed. The place was cheap and we were eager to settle in. Our first few days were uneventful. The house was quiet, and the only noise came from the howling wind outside. Our toddler, still adjusting to the new environment, would often stand in her room and wave at the closet, saying, "Hello there." We thought it was just her being a typical toddler. Our older daughter, however, was more perceptive. One night she came running into our room, tears streaming down her face. She had seen someone or something reaching out from the closet in her sister's room. Her scream cut through the silence like a knife. "Leave us alone, please leave, don't hurt us." Panicked, I grabbed the kids and locked us in my room. I called 911, my heart racing. The police arrived, but their investigation turned up no forced entry. They found footprints in the fresh snow around the house, but no sign of anyone entering. They assured us it was probably just a prank or a case of misinterpreted shadows. I wasn't convinced. Over the next few weeks, things took a darker turn. One night as I slept, I felt a tight grip on my ankles. Assuming it was one of the kids, I called out for them to stop. When I finally looked up, my heart almost stopped. At the foot of my bed stood a girl in a nightgown with long black hair. She vanished before my eyes. I searched the house, but there was no sign of anyone. The next day, I spoke with the neighbors. They told me about the previous family, how there had been frequent police visits due to reported abuse. The mother had left with the son, but the daughter had simply disappeared. My blood ran cold when I learned that the daughter had long black hair. I knew then that our time in that house was running out. After that night, the atmosphere in the house became more oppressive. I tried to keep a brave face for the kids, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. The unsettling feeling was always there, like a cold draft that refused to leave. I'd find myself checking over my shoulder more often, the house's creaks and groans sounding louder and more menacing in the dead of night. Our toddler's behavior grew stranger. She began insisting on leaving the door to her closet slightly ajar. "They're watching," she'd say, her innocent face grave. I brushed it off as her imagination, but her older sister grew increasingly anxious. She complained of feeling watched and would sometimes wake up screaming in the middle of the night. I kept telling myself it was just stress from the move, but it was hard to ignore the mounting evidence that something was wrong. One particularly snowy evening, as I was getting the kids ready for bed, the house seemed colder than usual. The wind howled outside, and the windows rattled with each gust. I put the kids to bed, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. But just as I was about to settle into bed myself, I heard what sounded like a faint, desperate whisper coming from the hallway. It was too soft to make out, but it sent shivers down my spine. I decided to investigate, my flashlight cutting through the darkness as I made my way to the source of the sound. The hallway was empty, but the air felt thick and heavy. I checked the kids' rooms and found nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the feeling of unease lingered, wrapping around me like a cold, clammy hand. That night I lay awake in bed, unable to shake the feeling that we were not alone. The wind outside picked up, creating a rhythmic sound that almost felt like a heartbeat. As I stared at the ceiling, I wondered if it was all in my head or if something truly sinister was happening in our home. The tension in the house reached a breaking point. Our older daughter's nightmares grew more frequent, and she began speaking of shadows moving in the corners of her room. I tried to comfort her, but her fear was palpable. Each night felt like a battle against an unseen enemy that no one else could perceive. One night, while the kids slept, I was jolted awake by a noise. It sounded like a soft, persistent scratching coming from the hallway. My first thought was that it might be an animal, but as I ventured out of the bedroom, I realized the sound was coming from inside the house. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept down the hall, the darkness swallowing the light from my flashlight. The scratching grew louder as I approached the kids' rooms. I flung open the door to my older daughter's room, but there was nothing there, just the empty space where her bed used to be. Confused, I turned around and saw the door to our toddler's room slightly ajar. I hesitated, then pushed it open. Inside, the room was eerily quiet. My daughter was fast asleep, but the closet door was wide open. I walked over and, with trembling hands, pushed the door shut. As I was about to leave, I noticed something unusual scratches on the inside of the closet door, as if something had been trying to get out. The next day, the snow had stopped, and I decided to take the kids outside for some fresh air. The sun was shining, but the crisp air did nothing to lift the gloom that had settled over us. We built a snowman in the front yard, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. As evening approached, the house seemed to close in on us. The shadows grew longer, and the familiar creaks of the floorboards took on a more sinister tone. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from the hallway. It was like a whispering, a voice that seemed to be pleading or warning. My heart raced as I realized that, once again, the sense of terror had returned. The sense of dread that had been building over the past few weeks reached its peak. That night, I could barely sleep, my mind racing with the eerie events that had unfolded in our home. The whispers from the hallway had become almost constant, a low murmur that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. I knew something had to be done. As I lay in bed trying to ignore the growing unease, I heard the sound again, a soft, scraping noise coming from the closet. My blood ran cold. I mustered up the courage to investigate one last time. The air felt heavy and oppressive as I approached the closet. I hesitated, then slowly opened the door. Inside, the closet was empty, just like before. But as I was about to close the door, I noticed something chilling. The familiar scratch marks on the inside of the door had become deeper, more pronounced. It was as if something or someone had been trying to claw their way out. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding. The next morning I decided it was time to leave. We packed up our belongings, trying to ignore the constant feeling of being watched. The house, once a hopeful new beginning, had become a source of terror. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house, its dark windows seeming to watch us leave. I felt a sense of relief, but also a lingering sadness for what we had endured. Once settled in our new home, the nightmares and strange occurrences stopped. It was as if the terror we had experienced in the old house had stayed behind. I never spoke of the incidents to anyone except close friends, afraid of sounding paranoid. But the experience had left a lasting mark on me, a reminder of how quickly a place can turn from a dream home into a living nightmare. Years later, I still think back on that house with a shiver. It remains a stark reminder of the unknown horrors that can lurk behind closed doors. The experiences we had there are etched in my memory, a part of our family's history that we rarely discuss but will never forget. And so we moved on, seeking solace in the knowledge that some doors are better left closed. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.